We're extremely happy to have Jose Dàvila with us, whose exhibition, The Circularity of Desire, opened recently at the gallery. It's a really remarkable exhibition, very complex exhibition, very interesting show. And it continues until June the 19th. So I do hope that most of you will be able to, or a lot of you will be able to see it. It also opened at the same time as the Frieze Art Fair. It was at the Shed, which is very close to the gallery. And we were happy after 15 months to be able to have a live art event with a large audience, very well controlled and managed event in New York with about 850 people a day, opening at the same time as Jose's exhibition, which was very close to us. So that was fantastic. So welcome, Jose. It's really nice to see you. I think you're coming from a slightly warmer Guadalajara than New York, although New York's beginning to warm up. I wanted to start talking about the exhibition. I know that you were conceiving this exhibition and planning it and thinking about it during COVID. And you came up with a very, very tight prescription for yourself for the exhibition, which is all to do with the history of the use of circles by us culturally. Can you talk a little bit about how you formulated that idea and explored it?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for being here. You know, I think actually, you know, I realized I had a very special time being isolated due to COVID. I was not in the city, I was not in my studio. I was isolated in a countryside house. And you realize how by being in a completely different context to where you normally work, it does actually also brings a lateral way of thinking and some other different ideas. And not necessarily these have to be like grand narratives, but sometimes very simple ideas can actually be the trampoline or starting point for an interesting way of developing a show. And in this case, it was. I mean, actually, for example, as you know, the very first work you encounter in the show is actually a copper apple that is hanged and counterbalanced by a stone in the floor. And you know, actually, you know, legend has it that a young Isaac Newton was sitting under an apple tree when he was hit on the head, no, by a falling apple. And funnily enough, you know, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague at that time when, you know, the Cambridge University was temporarily closed, and Isaac Newton was forced to move back to his childhood home. And it was during that period that he was in the orchard and was witnessing like apple drop from a tree. So it's funny, like how history in a way repeat itself, and they call it like, it's basically a circle is a form of repetition as well. So it came to me how everything was somehow related to a circular thought I was having upon my interest in gravity and how making sculpture and artworks make visible something that it's not, that it's invisible. But also this like fable of the apple in a way is a metaphor on how artworks actually do develop themselves. How art is also a way to tell a story, and it is also a vehicle to try to make things visible and simple that can maybe come from actually a difficult concept, or perhaps a simple thought, but it's a vehicle to communicate. And I personally think that Isaac Newton was using this metaphor, this fable of the apple, to try to actually communicate what it was then a very complex theory, that it was not easy to understand. If you told someone in that time about force of gravity, it was like, what? So he had to use a very like simple story to be able to communicate this idea he was having. And I guess in that sense, art is very much about that. And that is why the very first work of the show is the fable of the apple in that sense. Also copper, the apple is in copper because copper is also one of the most used materials for sculpture through the history of sculpture. And the show is very much about history as well.
It's interesting that you reference, you make that reference, because when I saw it installed, I went to another fable, which is a little older, which is the expulsion from the garden, you know, and the apple as a symbol of our expulsion from, you know, from this Eden into the reality of the real world, and the fall of Adam and Eve. Maybe I was being too biblical, and I should have stuck with the more scientific interpretation. But it does give us a very nice introduction. Of course, the apple's a very circular object. It does give us a very nice introduction to what you see when you round the corner and you go into the show, which is in the main gallery, a number of works that are all composed around the idea of the Platonic symbol of the circle. And you talked very eloquently about the search for the perfect circle, which has been one of the sort of, you know, the holy grail of art making throughout cultural history. And of course, nobody can make a perfect circle. It's never been achieved. And in the first painting on the left, the large diptych on the left of the gallery, the Circle of Craftsmen, you start off almost with an attempt to make that perfect circle that gradually spins out of control.
Yes, I mean, actually, as I was just talking how I was isolated and these like simple thoughts that come to you when you are in a different context, as you very well point, Sean, this, in a way, simple thought about the impossibility for us to draw a perfect circle, even though we can actually make amazing things as, you know, as humans, and achieve incredible, you know, advances. But however, something as, could one think, as simple as just drawing a perfect circle, it's something that is actually non-achievable for human reality. You know? And I think that like struck me, and I was also with my daughter drawing, and I realized how suddenly, you know, you could actually perfectly pair this idea that once we are, for example, in the middle of the pandemic, in the early stages of the pandemic, we had like to go back to simple things one by one, just like simple sort of like achievements, but this could not be actually achieved. And obviously in the history of art is super interesting. For example, obviously you can go back to the Black Circle of Malevich, I think like in 1915, something like that, and how he was actually trying to achieve this like new symbolic, independent, non-objective world. And then one thing just led me to another, and it was just tons of references by tons of different great like painters and artists, always using the circle as an angular point of their work. And that painting, the Circle of Craftsmen, is actually basically talking about how we can't craft a perfect circle. And I was just trying to let myself not achieve what it's non-achievable, no? And the very abstract way of trying to paint a circle and not being able to do so. And the relation to a perfect circle and to the abstract craftsman of a circle. How we craft our world, how we construct it, is a basic element. No?
So Jose, I was very interested by when I saw this group of paintings, which I think really are like you have been making paintings for some time, but I think this group of paintings take it to a whole nother level. I was fascinated by the fact that this painting, the Circle of Craftsmen, has this reference which we've seen in the work before, which is the text on it is taken from a book to do with art, right, or art history. But the other paintings, the three of the other paintings have text, and in each case, those three paintings all have to do with anatomy. Why was, I mean, it was fascinating to me, firstly, that there was that shift from art history to anatomy, but also that in the paintings with the anatomical references, there's this beautiful use of other images stacked on top of each other, almost like sedimentary art history references that create these very strong verticals or uprights, the way that we are upright as human beings. Can you talk about that shift that occurred in this body of work?
Absolutely, because it was something that was very important for me to make this sort of like link between, we cannot, talk about evolution without talking anatomy and the relation of even like our human form, our anatomy has actually evolved, obviously. And art history is a constant evolution. And I was using these circles in the history of art, painted by another great artist, both superimposing them as almost like as a palimpsest, almost as the reference to the very old like painting caves in which something was painted on top of something else. And that is also, again, a perfect metaphor of art history and evolution and the anatomic part of art history, let's say, and how we evolve, and how it is also through the understanding of human anatomy that we can also understand our limitations, our human limitations. And it is through our human limitations that we therefore develop ideas to overcome these limitations. So to me, it made like a perfect sense to pair, let's say, this history of the circle in art history and text of or human anatomy. And then by doing this, then you find you have this very, let's say, traditional technique, let's say, by joining a graphic or a painting form with some text that has no relation, apparently, but then you give the viewer the way to create a relation between what they see and what they read. And then you open a window to an endless way of relations that the viewer can make. And I was also very interested into that because I'm doing this relation myself, but by doing this joint of image and text, I'm opening a window for people to make all kinds of different relations they want.
Yeah, you're invited to make all sorts of different associations. So if we could go back to the previous painting, I just want to dwell on this for a second, because so for instance, in this one painting, there are maybe 8 or 10 references to other artists stacked on top of each other, as I said, in a sort of very sedimentary way, not in any chronology, not in any art historical chronology, but the form you end up with is a very totemic form, which is another very ancient form that we all, respond to, which is the totem, which is the upright form traditionally placed in the landscape, was a symbol of us as human beings. But I love, Picasso once said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And I love the idea that you are literally, nicking references here from other artists. So, I mean, if we go through, we can probably recognize, Frank Stella or Willis de Castro or Marcel Duchamp in these paintings. But I love the fact that you're actually kind of very cheekily, Sonia Delaunay, Robert Delaunay, you're taking from all these different references, stacking them up and asking us to make our own associations.
Precisely, yes. It's like I'm sort of like a magpie picking on certain parts of history of art openly, obviously, because then, and then actually this phrase is a reference to Isaac Newton again, about the standing of on the shoulders of giants, right? So yeah. Therefore, I just found in history of art all these beautiful circle references that I understand can be reused, recomposed, recontextualized, and by doing this, you create new narratives, a new meaning. But you don't have to create a new narrative and a new meaning just by creating a new circle or a new form or a new graphic, but by using what is already existing, no? And I like the fact that you point out this idea of the totem or the totemic figure, because it's very much in the relation of a vertical thing that used to try to create like a contact between the sky and the ground, no?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's always fascinated me about your work and that of a number of your colleagues is that you and a number of artists of your generation were trained as architects. You haven't practiced as an architect, but I always see this relationship to building blocks and being very playful with material and stacking and building things up in your work as psychologically coming from your training formally as an architect. Is that still relevant for you, or is that a sort of, that was then and this is now?
Well, it is relevant to me in the sense that actually brings an idea on how to relate with the world that surrounds you and how to understand how we have constructed the world in which we live. I mean, that brings us to like the word constructivism. I think it's essential in the show. Not only, let's say, in understanding constructivism as a theory that says like that learners construct knowledge rather than just passively take in information. And that's how I wanted to actually construct these paintings in a conceptual way of painting, trying to construct like new narratives. But also then the idea of the constructivist movement in art, no, basically something that borrowed ideas from Cubism, suprematism, futurism, but that actually was trying to be like a lighting idea of a new set of art, and that therefore also comes to the notion, for example, of the black circle. So it's not that I got into, I could say that it could also almost sound as a conspiracy theory, but I just started to find dots that were actually making everything I was looking at and crafting for the show come together. And well, in that sense, yeah, I mean, it's important how you construct your world, and that reference from architecture to me.
If that's a conspiracy theory, it's one of the more benign ones that are being batted around at the moment, thankfully. So if we can look at if we could just look at the other paintings in the show, and then I want to come to the sculptures. So this is the only painting that doesn't have text. and its title is Walking in Circles. And obviously here you're employing the circles, but punching this square void out of them.
Yes, that and it was very important to, for example, leave one painting in the show without the text.
Yeah.
Because I'm always interested into, let's say, breaking the system. Whenever you think there's a systematic way of doing something, then you do something differently. So therefore, you actually break that system. You disconnect it from something that just keeps on repeating itself.
I think one of the things I love the most about this show, Jose, it's your third exhibition with us, and I really think it's a triumph. I mean, I think the show is incredibly strong, but what I love is that it is very intellectually rigorous and restrained, and you can join the dots. But as you say, the minute you think you've joined all the dots, and I know that's a funny metaphor talking about circles, but the minute you think you've joined the dots, you sort of disrupt us, because there is always this playfulness in the work. There's a sort of cheekiness to it, which I really appreciate. And in this painting, it almost feels like the circles are consuming the painting. It's got a very sort of Pac-Man feel to it.
Yeah, no, that's essential. It's essential for me. And for example, that painting that we're looking at now, it's also a graphic reference to a very important work by Willis de Castro,
yeah,
in which all those forms are in a deep blue color. So by actually using the graphic almost as a template, in a way, as a template palette, to then actually paint it on top, both with circles from history of art, like the plot just keeps on getting like more complex every time and more open, and that's what I was interested in, as you point, to just try to keep on joining all possible dots into making like a complex story, like a complex thing.
So let's look at the other two paintings. We saw one of them earlier. And again, there's this very totemic stacking. This painting makes a specific reference to anatomy. So let's put it into the Newton category. And then the painting that we'd seen earlier briefly, if we can go back to that, this painting, of course, you know, I love, because it's got the reference to Duchamp and his ocular experiments. And we're going to see another reference to Duchamp elsewhere in the show, in a wonderful sculpture. But this painting really has more to do with optics, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because, you know, I really like the idea of, let's say, kind of like freezing roto relief, actually like it's like decomposing Duchamp in a way that then, by showing the roto relief, but frozen, not moving. So, and just for the graphic itself when it's actually stable. And so it's deconstructing, let's say, that part of Duchamp. And the way also I really like to make a link to Hilma af Klint, because of all these, let's say, esoterical way of seeing something that is not there, with a connection of all the like spirits, and the idea that painting actually can make you see things that are not part of this, like, let's say, human world. So I could talk over, and I could talk a lot of things, but it's also important to say that therefore also the works have a final composition, and that it's important in itself. Like I'm very interested in that someone can actually look at the work and not listen to anything I have to say, and still be compelled to actually make these associations and be attracted to it just by the work itself. You know? But like I can talk a lot about it, but I'm also very interested in letting the work talk by itself.
I mean, I have to say, when the show is being installed, I felt, you know, to me, it felt like you'd made a show which was very personal for me, you know, because there were all these references in there that I got and I loved. Um, and we'll look at a sculpture coming up now of that I think Duchamp would have very wryly appreciated. But I felt like, you know, you'd almost made the show very personally for me. It felt like a very personal exposition, which I really appreciated. So in the foreground, there's two sculptures. The sculptures, there are three sculptures presented on two plinths. In the foreground here is a sculpture, the Traveler's Item, obvious reference to Duchamp, but a rather wonky bicycle wheel that has been arrested by a very large block of concrete. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because I think this is where the humor and the cheekiness comes to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's very humorous, and it's difficult to inject humor in art. I think it's actually very difficult.
It's pretty difficult to inject it into concrete too.
Yeah, and as you say, I'm sure it's something that Duchamp would find funny, therefore interesting, because I'm also using a bicycle wheel that is not in a perfect shape, not in a perfect state. So it's a bit bended, and therefore has a story behind that we have to assume or associate. And also, in a way, to me, the concrete block, it's all against the possibility of traveling. It's heavy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's difficult to move. It's all like it's a total like opposition to what like the bicycle wheel stands for in a way. But they're bound together, you know? And that's when suddenly a certain part of a poetic moment can arise.
And then if we can look at the Acapulco chair stack, I have to say, Jose, I so love this piece because, of course, we all know the eponymous and iconic Acapulco chair, which was, I think, made as a very, a sort of, it's become a sort of modernist icon, but it was made as a very simple, relatively cheap chair to make that was very good for a hot climate. And here you've taken different size Acapulco chairs, stacked them up rather apparently precariously, and then balanced them with two river stones. And I think this sort of notion of the sedimentation of culture in this piece is just so beautifully and funnily expressed, because of course the Acapulco chair is a Mexican item, a Mexican icon. So when this came out of its box, I just was totally fell in love with it.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It's also a work that I cherish very much, because as you say, it's very Mexican because of all the references of the Acapulco chair and its relation to the climate, to the weather, to a certain sense of simpleness, of easiness. It's also, you know, in that chair, it's also made for you to lose time. You know, it's not a chair, it's not a Scandinavian chair. It's not for a, it's actually a chair to relax and spend some like time doing in a way like nothing. It's almost like if someone wanted to convert a hammock into a chair in a way.
Yeah.
It has certain kind of same principles. And when I have this stack of the base for Acapulco chairs, I could never stop seeing, for some reason, the bottle rack, the Duchamp's bottle rack in a way. And different like, but also I would see circles, I would see triangles, I would see somehow with the shape, it would be like drawing in space, three-dimensional drawing.
Yeah.
So all sorts of things came to my head when I have this object and I was working with it. And the river stones are shaped by rolling of the water, so they're already very smooth and they are they are moving by nature. And I don't know, I had this work had a lot of very personal references to me, but nevertheless also like reference to history of art. And I think you are very right. It's actually a show that is very personal to me.
Yeah.
And the references are actually references of affinities that I have with certain artists that I personally like and enjoy looking at their work, and or history or stories that have, like, for me, looking at certain kind of work that have opened a lot of ideas for me.
Yeah, I think really what comes across to me very clearly in this exhibition is that the time that you had in the studio, much of it on your own, quietly during the pandemic, has really enriched the work in an incredibly personal way, because it feels like you were able to spend time with artists whose work you revere and love, thinking about their achievement and sort of, as you mentioned, a magpie earlier, almost like appropriating from them and reconstituting ideas. And it does feel very, very personal. It's a very touching show, I find. Elsewhere in the main gallery, there's 3 other sculptures, all that reference back to the first sculpture we looked at and relate to Newton in a particular way. They all involve suspension. One is very simple, A Secret Wish, which is the work in the foreground here, which is a stone suspended in space. There's the largest sculpture, The Old Tree is Worth Keeping After All, which deals not just with suspension, but balance and codependency to no small extent. But I guess I'd like to, before we move downstairs to look at the work in the lower gallery, I'd like to talk about Completed Cycle, because it seems in a way to allow us to close out this conversation about this group of works in a very purposeful way. So it's a mirrored ball suspended above a perfect cone of sand, which is formed just by gravity. It's poured out of a cone and it forms another cone, so it completely relies on gravity. But the mirrored ball reflects the entire exhibition, 360 degrees. And of course, the glass and the mirroring couldn't exist without sand. Sand is one of the most ubiquitous materials in the world, but it's also something that is used in our everyday lives, whether we're aware of it or not. So this object sort of completes the circle, literally, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes.
It takes a raw material and transmutes it in a rather alchemic way into something that represents everything that we've been talking about.
I mean, the title in this work is essential, because it opens precisely what this work is about. It's like the whole show, it's somehow it's included in this work. Is that sense that the mirror ball is like a panopticon, but it's also, it not only contains the whole space around it because of the reflection, but it contains somehow conceptually the whole show. No? It has also, I have to say, to me personally, it has an obvious reference to Robert Smithson, which was also an artist that I very much enjoy, but three-dimensionally, and the sphere as a volume, not only the mirror as a plane, but rather three-dimensionally. And that mirror ball has a very personal reference to me, because it was somehow, let's say, got famous in Mexico because it was used by Luis Barragan in his houses. And story has it that it was actually a painter, Chucho Reyes, who gave this glass mirror sphere as a present to Barragan, because these glass spheres are produced in the town of Tlaquepaque, here in Guadalajara.
Uh-huh.
They are very well known, how to say, like decorative craftsmanship of Tlaquepaque.
Yeah.
And they were considered to be like just, local handcrafts. But then they got like very famous into Barragan. So it's something that then is very personal to me, because I live in Guadalajara, and I remember these like spheres from Tlaquepaque. Then they are part of Barragan's iconography in their houses. So there's a lot into this work, even if it seems as only a glass sphere and a pile of sand.
Oh, that's interesting that you mentioned Chucho Reyes, because I'd always thought that, of course, you're talking about the great architect Luis Barragan, who collaborated a lot with Matthias Geritz, and I'd always thought that reference came from Geritz. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, they were all, as you know, like friends and colleagues.
Yeah.
But it's not an official story, but I hear that. But Chucho Reyes was actually a guy that was very much actually bringing, let's say, handcraftship into Barragan's knowledge, into Matthias Gerrit's knowledge. Like, he was a guy, Chucho Reyes, who go to like different like ateliers of local craftsmen. And story has it that Barragan used to always ask Chucho to bring him like objects whenever he wanted to make a present to someone. He would ask like, Chucho, please bring me a present because I'm having like someone for dinner, someone is visiting. And Chucho like always came with very weird special objects. And apparently this was one day, and then Barragan just kept it. There's a lot of stories, a little bit like fables.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they're fables again.
So, do you want to talk about the old tree, or can we go downstairs to the the collage works downstairs? Which would you prefer?
Well, I say that sculpture, if we can, the old tree is worth keeping after all. I mean, I get obviously a lot of fun working with the titles. I think it's an essential part of the work. It's a very personal way when you get to the moment of titling a work. And I do accumulate a lot of objects in my studio. I have this like ecosystem of objects. For example, I had the Acapulco chairs for more than 7 years, and finally they found the moment that they could become an artwork. For example, these pieces of wood were actually part of a vegetable garden I was building in the pandemic with my wife, and I had these like driftwood, we didn't use them at the end, and I realized I had to I wanted to try to compose a sculpture out of it, just to keep the idea of like circling like a material that can become many things, and how it's basically a tree becomes a piece of wood, becomes a vegetable garden, becomes so many things depending on how you use it, because at some point they were also used for the train railroads. That's what they were used for. So this idea of keep using a material for many things was important for me. And then I just like brought it from the isolation to the studio, and then, well, it is what it is now. And that stone is actually, in a way, like a symbolic, platonic, wanting to be a perfect circle, a perfect sphere. But then unless you have something you want to talk about, we can go downstairs to the silkscreen.
So in the lower gallery, there's a group of these beautiful works, incredibly intimate, collages. They're all titled Discontinuous Order. And to describe them very briefly, they are poor packaging materials. There you can spot Mexican Epson boxes being reused and Amazon packaging, etc., that are being screen printed on again with circles, cut up, reconstituted, reorganized, revamped. And I was showing these to somebody last week, and they immediately started talking about Robert Rauschenberg, which, you know, I think is obvious and not obvious at the same time, but a beautiful reference to the use of poor materials to be elevated to high art, which Bob was always playing with, those sort of the pendulum swing of high and low. So can you talk us through these a little bit?
Yes, of course. Actually, it's good that we're talking about them just after we talked about the wooden sculpture, the tree work keeping after all, because they are very much about the idea of recycle. And then therefore we're touching again the word cycle into all of it. And you know, these are silkscreen prints on top of cardboard that I used to do, and the idea how I like to, for weeks and weeks, plan the graphics that I was going to silkscreen, to therefore suddenly have a good amount of cardboard, and in a very short period of time actually have the creative moment of composing by cutting, by, you know, just like tearing apart, also with my hands, pieces of cardboard. And I also realized I had a really good amount of cardboard already in my studio that come in different like materials and products I use in the studio anyway, for cleaning, for, you know, the printer, for like, and the whole idea of recycling the material I already had was very appealing to me, because it would also play not only the idea of recycling, but also the graphics on the cardboard existing would make a compositional dialogue with what I was still screening on. So even this image we're looking at in the center.
Yeah, I was just about to point that out.
Yeah, there's a circle that actually is not even a print, but it's actually just like a mark of I think it's actually a beer that was like there because it was like a beer case.
Yeah, and actually there's a lovely moment in the show where that's actually the first piece that's hung in the downstairs gallery, because I think I'm right in saying it's the only one where there's an imprint, a physical imprint into the cardboard with that circle and the mark of its usage, almost as if something had broken or leaked onto the cardboard. And it's, you know, like putting a coffee cup down and getting an imprint of a coffee cup. And there's this beautiful moment on that piece where you have the beginning of, in a way, you could say the beginning of this whole idea of thinking about these collage works that then becomes sort of spun out throughout the group of works and articulated more and more in a more and more sophisticated way. But it starts with a very simple circle. And I think also, Jose, it's fair to say that, you know, as these have gone through the process of being, you know, very modest cardboard boxes to becoming works of art, I think we can also describe them as being upcycled as well as recycled, because they certainly now occupy a very elevated position in the galleries. So, but there's an intimacy to them. There's a wonderful, playful intimacy to them that's very, very beautiful.
And I've been personally, as you're saying, with the intimate part, I'm also always been personally very attracted to cardboard as a material. No, I have used it also in sculpture previously, and I've always been very interested in the qualities of this cheap material, this like povera material that it's somehow undivisible for what we use every day. You know, it's a material that is very present in our everyday life, and it's been also used by artists that I really cherish. So it's a material that it's a personal, almost fetish to me in a way.
Yeah, yeah. There's a wonderful intimacy to these pieces. Okay, so as you probably all gather, and you've all stayed with us, so thank you so much. Jose and I love talking about art, and we could spend all day doing it quite happily, but we are conscious of time passing. So I want to, I don't know if there are any questions. If anybody has any questions, please do send them in, and we'll try and do some quick Q&As at the end. But before we do that, I just want to go back upstairs to the front gallery and talk about what seems like you know, a very different body of work, but I feel that they're very strongly related, because this brings us literally, all puns intended, full circle. We started off talking about the Platonic ideal of making the perfect circle by hand, which you can't do. And in this body of work, you've chosen to look very closely at details which are taken from Roy Lichtenstein paintings, where there are these wonderful brush strokes, which we saw in the very first painting we discussed, of you making that painting, the brush stroke, trying to make the circle. And here we have these beautiful brush strokes that are compositionally taking us right back to the beginning of the process, but in a very sophisticated way.
I really like we are somehow ending the conversation here, because it's very much about the cycle of everything. We're somehow finishing where we started. And these paintings, these works are very much about that in painting. I mean, it's also the show, it's a love letter to painting, to the act of painting, to the way I long about like painting. And I think obviously that's what also originally Roy Lichtenstein was doing, you know, his passion for painting in the very act of the moment when you're actually like doing a brush stroke. And then I really wanted to focus on the moment the brush stroke is actually going into like a circular motion. You know? It's actually these brush strokes in a moment of circularity and the very action of painting, which defines in a way the whole show. So I think it's a very important part actually.
Yeah, and there's just a wonderful kind of exuberance to this group of works in the first gallery. They almost feel as, because they're details, they almost feel as if they're liberated from carrying some of the weight of association that's been being built up through the show, and it makes them feel even more joyous, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a question here. I think we've answered some of it, but I'm going to read it out because it's from another wonderful artist, actually, who's joined us today, Jitish Kalat. And Jitish said, the exhibition powerfully evokes a tense precariousness as it repeatedly hovers between collapse and ascent. Would it be possible for you to talk about the idea of time in the exhibition as circles toggle between two-dimensional form and intersecting clocks, the exposed sand pyramid that evokes the archetypal hourglass? You talked a little bit about time with the boulders, the river boulders, and the Acapulco Chair stack. Do you want to expand upon that notion of human time and geological time? That's
yes, I would love to. I think it's actually a great question that I want to thank very much. Posed by Yitish Kalat, because, you know, definitely, I mean, we cannot, you know, normally, you know, even the form of a clock, it's a circle, actually, and therefore time is present in everything in the show, and it's very accurate to talk about, you know, this sort of collapse and ascent. You know, these two poles that actually hold the show together, you know? And because they're joined by the idea of gravity. there would not be collapse or ascent without gravity being the main sponsor of the two. And by obviously the sand being there put is obviously a sort of an idea of having to wait, and the way, very personally, my whole relation to time was profoundly affected by the pandemic. And I think you can actually see this in the show, obviously. And I think time has been greatly affected, mainly for the good, basically in everyone. But I think the rhythm of life in many ways has changed and hopefully stays that way. And I just actually, I was hoping this would be visible in the show. So I'm very glad to read this question.
Apparently it is. So Leslie Markle asks, can you touch upon Jose's public art practice, and are there any projects in the works, public art projects?
Well, I'm actually developing like a couple of ideas for public art projects in Mexico, but not yet, not really yet in the moment I could really talk about them, because they're yet just in the air. No? I'm not. There's not really much I have in there.
But it remains part of your practice that you're committed to, working in space in a very proactive way.
Yes, of course. I mean, actually, I do enjoy public projects profoundly, because the public projects actually make people almost like stumble upon them. It's like, like a lot of people like go to galleries, go to museums, go to like art institutions, and they are already like going because they want to see that show. Yeah. And the public projects you stumble upon in the Malecon of Havana, yep, or the project I did in Boston with now they're outside of the aquarium, are projects that everyone just like walks by or walks through. And it's very interesting to have that encounter with people that is not purposely looking to see art. Suddenly they relate to a piece of art that maybe changes, even for a split second, their experience during their day. And that's something that I think is very, very nice.
Yeah.
I really enjoy doing.
So perhaps one last question, because we don't want to keep people too long and impose upon them too much. But Emma has asked, in the Freeze video, there is, by the way, a wonderful video made by Freeze of this exhibition for Jose's show that's on our website, you can see, so do please check that out. And Emma said, you mentioned in the Freeze video that the paintings in this show are some of the largest you have made. And I noticed that there's almost a cutout quality to the paintings that remind me of the wonderful cutout series. Was this intentional? And can you speak about why painting in particular was so important to you for this exhibition?
Yes. I mean, painting was very important for me in this exhibition because it was something I found myself doing for most part in an intimate way during these past like 12 months. And I wanted to reflect this strongly, but also the fact that I hadn't been able, or not been able, but I hadn't really articulated a show through the medium of painting. And to be able to do this for the first time was very significant for me. To be able to have painting as a vehicle to articulate the show was something for me that was quite, let's say, new and meaningful.
So, Jose, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with us all about the exhibition. The exhibition is absolutely magnificent. It really is very, very beautifully conceived and installed. It's very layered, very sophisticated, but also very joyous exhibition. And I think it does communicate all the preoccupations with time that you've invested in it over the last year, and the planning for the show, which is so brilliant, really does come across very well. As I say, you and I could spend weeks talking together, because it's always such a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.
And the way that you think. And I just want to make a final request. I think that it would be, you know, our birthdays are just 3 days apart later this month, just prior to the exhibition closing. And I think it'd be very nice if we have a private finissage together for our birthdays. What do you say?
I say yes. Let me think about it.
Okay, all right. So we'll plan. We can't invite you all, but we'll plan that. So Jose, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank everyone who's been watching us talk, and thank you and everyone at the gallery for having made this show possible, because it really does mean a lot to me. And it's very significant. Thank you.
It's a great exhibition. I hope everybody gets a chance to see it in person. And we'll talk very soon. Take care. Thank you.
Ciao.